I recently purchased a Raspberry Pi 4, the 8 gig model, which by itself is quite exciting. But on top of it, I also bought this HQ camera. I also purchased many other accessories, which I'll be showing you throughout this video. And the overall idea is that I want to create a self-contained camera system with the Raspberry Pi 4. Right now in the video, I'm just going through and I installed some heat sinks, nothing too fancy, and I used the FAT32 formatter and installed Raspbian onto the SD card that I purchased. I did purchase a rather large SD card because the idea is that I will be taking a lot of 1080p video with this camera, and I want to make sure I have plenty of room to store that video feed. Once I had it installed, the only configurations I did, other than enabling Wi-Fi, was to go to the Raspberry Pi configurations and enable the camera. And then also via command line, I installed remote desktop, as you can see here, just so that I would be able to remotely access the device to pull data off of it later. Now what you're seeing here is the screen that I purchased. 4-inch LCD screen, comes with a case that goes around the Raspberry Pi, connects via HDMI via that little adapter you saw, and it also is a touchscreen. It's a passive style touchscreen, meaning you would need a stylus. Now, the screen connects via GPIO pins as well, and that's where they would get the ability to use that touchscreen. And the instructions here are pretty good. Pretty straightforward instructions using pictures. I already had the camera installed. It's pretty simple. It just connects with that ribbon cable. Interestingly, you'll see those heat sinks. Those heat sinks came with the screen, and they're for the Raspberry Pi. But I was like, I don't need these. I already have heat sinks. Now, what you'll see later is that they provided those low-profile heat sinks for a reason. The reason being, there's a fan that also comes with a screen that is going to get in the way of the CPU heatsink, actually. So you'll see that later. So right now, I'm just taking the standoffs, which I bought that little standoff kit, by the way. I'll put a link to that below as well, because that thing came in handy later, as you'll see. Right now, I'm just installing the standoff so I can get that piece of plastic, the backing installed. I'll also go ahead and tell you, you'll see later in the video, that piece of plastic, the backing to that case, gets completely destroyed. And we'll see that later. I end up not using it in the end. And there's that fan I was talking about. So yeah, it's pretty cool. It comes with a fan. But here in a minute you'll see, I'll slow it down in a minute so you can see that that fan is not going to allow me to fully seat those GPIO pins. Yeah, so right here you can see that it won't even let me plug in the HDMI. And I had to think about it for a minute here, and I was like, oh shoot, that's what happened. And I ended up taking it off and installing only the one heatsink got in the way, the CPU heatsink. So that's the only one I remove here and install the low profile heatsink instead. Try twisting it off. That did not work. I ended up just prying it off with a screwdriver. But if you think about it, you're like, man, you're prying on a CPU with a screwdriver? Get out of here. Only on a Raspberry Pi, right? Only on a Raspberry Pi. So there's that low profile heatsink. That'll ensure that we're not in the way of that fan. And so the other heat sinks don't get in the way. So that's good. And then there's a little bit of adhesive right there that kind of pops onto. It's very simple installation. As far as getting the screen attached, it's pretty straightforward. Just make sure you line up those GPIO pins and get those seated properly. And then, as you'll see here, the HDMI adapter to micro pops right on, no problems now. And that little piece of plastic, oh, that gave me some grief trying to get that lined up properly. Not to mention all this protective paper on the plastic. Oh, man. Took a hot minute to get that off. Yeah, so as you can see, it looks good. I mean, there's no real issues here. The whole thing went together, no problems, using those standoffs. And you'll see the screen works great. But yeah, just keep in mind that piece of plastic on the back there really got in the way of the other accessories that I purchased. So you'll see that the screen does come on. You might be able to see it. However, the touchscreen does not yet work. You'll see me using my Ninja Turtle stylus. So what you have to do is go to the wiki page, which I'll provide a link below, and the manufacturer provides instructions both on how to install an image of Raspbian with the drivers pre-installed, or like what I did is used just some code here on the command line to get the drivers off of a GitHub link that they provide. And once you download that, the drivers for me, as you'll see, the touchscreen worked great, no issues there. I don't plan on using the touchscreen a whole bunch. That's kind of just like a bonus feature for me. And what I'm going to show you next is just using the keyboard. And this is why I won't use the touchscreen too much, because you got to use the command line to use this camera. You can use Raspi Still to shoot video, and you can use Raspi Vid to shoot video. And there's a string of commands that you can use in conjunction with these to make them do whatever you want them to do. Now, the next accessory I had was a battery pack, as you can see here. The battery pack takes two 18650 batteries, and right here in the video is kind of where things went downhill for me for a while. Like I said, that back piece of plastic, my hope initially was that I would be able to put the battery pack just like on top of it, right? So what I ended up doing was cutting a bunch of holes into this piece of plastic using my Dremel, which you'll see here in a minute. I'm pointing at these pins on the bottom of the screen, and those make contact with the back of some GPIO pins. There's a close-up view of it for you. And so when I saw those, I was like, well, yeah, I can just cut that out, and it'll be no problems. I can just get the pins in by this tiny little hole that I'm going to cut out with my Dremel. So as you can imagine, that unfortunately did not work. The plastic was too thick, and other components were getting in the way. So then as you'll see in a minute, I continued and continued to cut away at this thing. I probably spent the better part of, I don't know, 2 hours just messing around with this piece of plastic. First, to try and make the battery fit on top of it. And then eventually I gave up on that. Eventually I was like, well, I can put the plastic on top of the battery compartment. So that's what I ended up trying to do. But then I realized that the camera was having issues with this piece of plastic as well. So then I started cutting things out for the camera. So yeah, long story short, none of this works. That piece of plastic it broke into pieces, unfortunately, because of how much I cut off. But luckily, at least for the moment, I'd say we don't necessarily need it. It would have been preferable because right now, or without it, the main function of that is to really hold the screen in place, which is why I wanted to keep it. But that didn't happen. And again, that standoff kit, you really got to get that. Obviously, some of these accessories came with some standoffs and some screws, but having those additional standoffs really gives you the ability to have some more flexibility in what you're doing. Yeah, so right here, I'm still just holding on to that dream that I can somehow use that piece of plastic to put it over the battery pack. And in case you're wondering, the HQ camera there, that base that it's on, that is a part of my Pure Gear tripod adapter. Makes it easy to just have a quick disconnect, essentially, to slide that on and off the tripod. So I can also provide a link to that. So here are some Samsung 25R 18650 batteries. I've had these for a while. They're really good batteries. I can also provide a link. And here you can see the battery pack is working. It even has some built-in LEDs to let you know the status of the battery. There's 4 LEDs there. Those blue LEDs, so that you know the charge on your batteries. So yeah, it's working great. The battery pack, the screen, everything's working. But I'm still just holding on to that dream that I can use that piece of plastic, even though it's not going to work out. And this last accessory here is from Pi-Hut. And it has it's a mounting plate for the camera And it also has a little level on top of it, which is a pretty cool addition. So yeah, the hope here was that I could put that mounting plate onto the back of that plastic. I'm looking at it, and there's things in the way. So again, with the Dremel, I start cutting away, and this is really where I got to a point cutting for that where that I realized eventually that this was not going to work. I will say though, the Dremel is a fantastic tool. So if you don't have one, I'd highly recommend it. Get one with a cord. I had a cordless one for a while. It's not the same. Yeah, so really just a couple hours here, just going back and forth, trying to make this work. Eventually, I do get to work by completely getting rid of that outer shell there. And as you can see right here, I kind of just turned the camera off. I was getting really frustrated, so I didn't get a lot of it on camera, but as you can see right here, eventually, without that outer shell, it actually made things a lot easier. I do have the self-contained Raspberry Pi camera with a touchscreen, a battery pack, and a big old lens. I'll put a link to that below as well. So a really good adjustable lens there from Articam. And I think I even show you here in a minute an example of using the keyboard of how to get this to work. Again, so what I did actually, and I might make a video on this later, I just created a script and made it runnable from the command line, the script called Video Bash. That way I don't have to type in a string of command line to record some video. Obviously, it's a manual focus, so I have to focus the camera once we get the preview window up and running. But as you can see, it's working great. I'm actually really impressed. I think it's a really impressive camera. Now, one thing I will show you here in a minute, that mounting plate from Pi-Hut is not perfect. You will see that some of the electronics on that circuit board are kind of getting smushed onto the back of that plastic, and I'm not a big fan of that. So I ended up taking it back off and using some standoffs just to get that off from having that smashed against the plastic. I didn't like the way that looked. So that's all we're doing here. So the camera is fully functional. I'm really happy with it. I'll probably post some videos up later of me using it. But really, I would say the only other things I want to do with this that would make it better is install some physical buttons using GPIO pins, to where instead of using a keyboard, I can just push a single button to take a video or a still picture. And additionally, the electronics of the Raspberry Pi and the battery pack are all kind of exposed to the elements. Now, obviously, I'm not going to take this on a water ride or anything like that, but I would like to find some kind of container or project box that I could better enclose this with, just so it's not as vulnerable to damage. But otherwise, I would say I'm really happy with the way this turned out. I think it looks pretty cool. Here in a second, I'll show you some still shots of it on my tripod. I mean, if nothing else, I think just the way it looks is kind of a cool factor. But it does take some pretty good pictures, some pretty good video, thanks to both the sensor and the lens, obviously. And yeah, that is a self-contained Raspberry Pi camera using just a few basic accessories found on Amazon.